Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are bringing some serious energy to a topic that literally every single person who has ever tried to learn a new language can totally relate to. We're diving deep into the fascinating science behind acquiring a new language, and specifically, we're going to take a really close look at that one thing we all absolutely dread, making mistakes. It's a universal fear, isn't it? The fear of failing, the fear of sounding, well, kind of foolish. But I want to hook you right out of the gate with a pretty provocative thought. What if fumbling a sentence, mixing up your verbs, or just completely butchering a pronunciation might actually be a positive sign? Seriously, could your language errors actually be a good thing? Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the language learner's dilemma, then meet pioneer Pitt Corder. After that, we'll cover the error analysis revolution, mistakes versus errors, where those errors actually originate, and finally, how to correct them effectively. Let's get right to it.
Part 1. The Language Learner's Dilemma. If you have ever sat in a language class, you definitely know the profound frustration and, the embarrassment of being constantly corrected when you're just trying to get a thought out. As this quote brilliantly points out, linguists and researchers like Claude Hagege and Freiermuth have actually shown that traditional, immediate correction can actively harm your learning. Think about it. When a teacher jumps in to correct every single slip-up, it totally interrupts the message you're trying to build. And what's the result? You get anxious. You develop this massive fear of making an error, and eventually, you just start avoiding participating altogether. Your motivation tanks, and you stop taking those necessary risks you literally have to take to learn. It's a huge dilemma.
Part 2. Enter pioneer Pitt Corder. So, to understand how the academic world finally woke up and realized things needed to change, we have to talk about a true linguistic maverick. Stephen Pitt Corder's journey is just fascinating. Born in York back in 1918 to a Quaker family, he was raised with really strong principles of pacifism and empathy. Fast forward to World War II, he served as a conscientious objector, actually driving ambulances across war-torn Europe and the Middle East. After the war, he traveled the globe for the British Council, teaching English in places like Colombia, Turkey, and Nigeria. All of this incredible, globally empathetic perspective culminated in 1964, when he became the very first professor of applied linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. His unique background totally set the stage to completely rethink how we approach language education. Part 3. The Error Analysis Revolution. By the late 1960s, Corder's unique perspective triggered a massive paradigm shift in academic linguistics. Up until then, the dominant theory was something called contrastive analysis. This was this very rigid behaviorist view that basically said learning a language was just about forming habits. Any error you made, well, that was seen as a bad habit caused by negative interference from your native language. It was just something to be wiped out. But then, Corder comes along and introduces error analysis. This was a cognitive view, a real game changer. He argued that errors are not failures at all. They're actually evidence of active hypothesis testing by the learner. Your brain is creatively trying to figure out the rules of this new language in real time. In his groundbreaking 1967 paper, Corder proposed that learners possess a built-in syllabus. So here is the absolute crucial point. An error isn't a broken version of the target language. Not at all. Instead, it's a unique, rule-governed system that's actively being built in the learner's mind, something he later called an interlingual. It's a lot like children acquiring their first language. Adult learners use this innate mechanism to test rules out. Errors are literally just stepping stones on that path. To actually study this, error analysis relies on a very structured four-step methodology proposed by researcher Ellis. First, you collect a sample of the learner's language, like a written essay or maybe a recorded conversation. Second, you identify the errors within that sample. Third, you describe them by categorizing them into linguistic buckets, like omissions or additions. And finally, step 4, which is definitely the most important, you explain the errors. You have to ask, why did the learner make this specific choice? Part 4, mistakes versus errors. Now, before we can explain why these slip-ups happen, we have to know exactly what we're looking at. Because in the world of linguistics, there is a very strict difference between a mistake and an error. A performance mistake is just a random slip of the tongue. It happens because you're tired, you're nervous, or maybe just distracted. If someone points it out, you can easily self-correct it because you actually already know the rule. A competence error, on the other hand, is a systematic gap in your knowledge. You can't self-correct it because it represents the actual current rule set that your brain is constructed for the new language.
Quarter urged us to basically ignore those transient performance mistakes and focus deeply on these competence errors. Part 5. Where do errors originate? So if we're focusing all our energy on competence errors, we really have to ask, where do they originate? Ellis's psycholinguistic model helps visualize this perfectly. You can see how the overarching concept of an error branches off. Down at the bottom, you have those performance mistakes we just talked about, processing problems, communication strategies, that kind of thing. But look up at the COP branch, competence errors. These branch further into two primary linguistic sources that researchers focus heavily on: transfer and intralingual factors. Let's break those down. The first source gives us intralingual errors. This is simply negative transfer from your mother tongue. Since you already have a perfectly good language wired into your brain, you inevitably rely on it. You might literally translate a sentence word for word from your native language straight into your new language. Now, while earlier linguists viewed this as a bad habit that needed to be crushed, error analysis sees it as a perfectly natural strategy. I mean, you're just using the tools you already have, right? But what about errors that have absolutely nothing to do with your native language? Well, those are intralingual errors. These happen when you creatively, but incorrectly, stretch the rules of the new language itself. There are four main culprits here. First is overgeneralization. This is like learning the ed past tense rule in English and saying he singed instead of he sang. Second is ignorance of rule restrictions, which is applying a perfectly good rule to a totally inappropriate situation. Third is incomplete application, like maybe dropping the auxiliary verb in a question because you realize people still understand you without it anyway. And fourth, hypothesizing false concepts, like assuming the word was is always required for the past tense. So you say something like, one day it was happened. Honestly, these are all signs of a highly active learning brain. Part 6. How to correct effectively. Okay, knowing all this amazing science, how should we actually handle language slip-ups in the real world? First, we have to accept that recognizing the true value of errors benefits absolutely everyone involved. It benefits the teacher because errors serve as a super clear diagnostic tool to track exactly how far the student has progressed. It benefits the researcher because it reveals the hidden universal strategies of human language acquisition. And most importantly, it benefits the learner because committing an error is the very device you use to test your hypotheses and grow your own unique interlanguage. Because errors are so vital, the pedagogical takeaway here is radically different from traditional schooling. According to researchers like Fryermuth, teachers should not correct everything. Let me repeat that. Do not correct everything. You should only correct errors that genuinely impede communication. If a student is just nervous, or if they make a minor slip but the meaning is still perfectly clear, just let it go. Interrupting a student's flow for a minor slip does way more harm than good. Save the corrections for the major roadblocks that actually stop understanding in its tracks. And when correction absolutely is necessary, self-correction is vastly superior to teacher correction. A researcher named Port developed this brilliant four-step method for students reviewing their own written essays. Instead of the teacher just handing over the right answers, the student reads their essay 4 separate times. First, they just look at verbs and tenses. On the second read, they hunt only for preposition errors. Third, they check nouns and agreements. And finally, they look for their own known personal trouble spots. Letting a learner discover the right form through a guided search locks it into their brain far better than a teacher's red pen ever could. So, having seen the science, the psychology, and the absolute pedagogical revolution sparked by Pittquarter, I want to leave you with a question to think about. How will you react the next time you fumble a sentence in a new language? Will you feel embarrassed and shut down? Or will you recognize that you're just actively building your own unique interlanguage? Embrace the errors, guys. They're literally your stepping stones to fluency. Thanks so much for watching this explainer, and keep learning.